All right, time to get started. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, A Secure Expert's Guide, an Introduction to Least Privileged Security with independent IT and security expert Russell Smith. You're also joined by Chris Owen, who will run through a brief overview of our Beyond Trust Solution Power Broker towards the end of the webinar, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today. I'd like to remind you to please submit your questions via the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. Also, today's session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 2 business days from now. So at this point, I'd like to hand it on over to Russell, who will jump right in. Hello, Russell. Welcome, and please take it away.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to today's session on least privileged security. As Sarah said, my name is Russell Smith, and I'm an independent IT consultant, and I specialize in Windows Server management and security. So a little bit about me. I blog for the Petri IT knowledge base, if you want to head over there, pretty much on a daily basis. And if you're interested specifically in security, you can head over to the archives at the Windows IT Professional website, and you'll find quite a lot of articles by me there. I'm a trainer with Pluralsight, and I've got a couple of courses there on Microsoft Azure, and I also blog for Netrix. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, please feel free to add me there. You can see my Twitter handle. I've also got a book out at the moment, which is the only book dedicated solely to the subject of least privileged security. And during the course of this webinar, I'll touch on some of the subjects that are in that book, but also there you'll find lots of useful information, not just about the technical challenges of implementing least privilege, but also the political problems that you might also face in your organization. Okay, so let's get on with the main part of today's session. So probably everybody is familiar with Apple iOS and Google Android, which we tend to use on our smartphones. And those devices have become very widespread and are even used more commonly now than a desktop PC. And of course, especially in the consumer space where that trend started. But what is it about those devices that makes them so popular with people? Well, one of the common things that those 2 operating systems have is that they share a curated app store. So what that means is that all the apps that we're able to download from Apple or the Google Play Store, in principle they've all been vetted and checked to make sure they meet a certain quality, that they're not infected with malware, and to give us a certain experience on those devices. Another thing that those 2 platforms have in common is that there's no administrative access to the underlying operating system for end users. So it makes those devices very stable and very reliable, and you don't have all of the problems that are specifically associated with legacy Windows PCs, for instance. And it's those 2 things that have helped to make them very popular. Of course, apart from their form factor, that we can carry them everywhere with us and they're very convenient, they're actually really easy to use and they just keep on working. But the experience that we have, of course, with legacy Windows is a little bit different, and why people tend not to use their PCs, even if they have one sitting in the corner, unless they really need to. Because Windows, let's face it, is really complex, and that complexity means that if anything gets changed accidentally or maybe sometimes on purpose, it can cause lots of problems with not only the security of the device but also make it unreliable. It might mean that we have to reinstall the operating system, or maybe if we're a consumer we have to call a friend to help us work out a problem. Now of course in the enterprise it's a little bit different, but the problem again with Windows even in the enterprise is that it requires a lot of IT resources to manage it if you want to keep it reliable and secure at the same time. And of course, a lot of the small businesses, they don't have the necessary expertise to keep Windows running quite as we would like it to. So I mentioned that iOS and Android, they don't give users administrative access to the operating system itself. And in a nutshell, that is what least privilege security is. So it's the idea of giving users the absolute minimum access they need in order to perform the tasks assigned to them. So in most cases, those users won't need administrative access to, I don't know, run Microsoft Word, for instance. It's just a privilege that they don't need. So in order to implement least privilege, we make sure that our user accounts are not part of the local administrators group on a Windows PC. Now, of course, by standard, those users, our domain users, are not part of the local administrators group, but quite often they get put in there, sometimes just by default because that's company policy, or that's what we've always done, or we know that we're going to run into problems if we don't make them part of that group. There's one other thing that I'd like to add, and while you might argue that it's not strictly least privilege security, it's also about limiting what users can do with their machines, and that is application control. So not only are we going to remove administrative rights, but we're also going to make sure that those users can only run applications that as an organization we have approved. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So why do we want to implement least privilege security? So again, you can think back to the example of Android and iOS maybe. So it considerably reduces the risk of malware infection. Now, while iOS and Android aren't completely immune to those things, they don't receive the same kind of attention that Windows does in that area. Even if we do get infected with a virus, if those users don't have administrative rights, there's the limit to what that code can do on the machine. So it's also about restricting the amount of damage that a hacker could do. Many regulatory codes now require organizations to implement least privilege security. So it's not an option of, do we want to do this, but in order to comply, we must do this. Something that you might connect back to application control is that, well, if we allow users to install whatever software they like on corporate machines, they can be installing software for which we don't have a license. So it can also be about legal issues in terms of software licensing. And in the long run, removing administrative privileges can help to reduce support costs, because we increase the reliability of those devices. So let me talk about application control in a little bit more detail. So removing users from the administrators group, unfortunately, isn't enough. So while that can help to protect from some malware, of course with the introduction of user account control, malware authors suddenly understood, well, users now, they don't necessarily have administrative rights by default, so we need to write malware that doesn't rely on that fact. So application control means that we can prevent malware that doesn't need administrative rights from launching in the first place. It can also prevent users from installing software that we don't want them to. Now, while no software does require administrative rights to install, there are some examples that don't. For instance, Google Chrome is what we call portable software, and that can be installed without any special privileges. Of course, we can also mention the reliability of devices, because if you allow users to install whatever they like, you can't be sure that that new piece of software isn't going to create a problem with the line of business application that is critical for that user to get their job done. As I said, Windows is a complex beast, and installing any unauthorized software can unfortunately upset the apple cart and cause problems that are going to generate calls to your help desk. And also with application control, we can control the scripts that run on the device. So for instance, we can either block all PowerShell scripts that are unsigned, or we can say, well, only signed scripts can run in full language mode, and all the rest will get a very restricted version of PowerShell, so hackers can't use it to do damage to the device. Now, there are two different options for application control that are built into Windows. Sorry, let's go back there. If you have Windows 10, there's a new system for application control built into the operating system called Device Guard. So you can use that as application control. It's only available in the Enterprise SDK. And if you have Windows 7 or higher, then there's App Locker, which is now a legacy application control system, but it's better than nothing. It works okay. And the only issue with application control is that you definitely do need to remove users from the administrators group, because if they are an administrator on the device, then they can easily bypass application control just by disabling the necessary services. So I mentioned a little bit about the problems implementing least privilege security. And here are some issues that you might come across. Of course, some of these issues might actually be positives in other respects, but anyway, let's have a look through what you might come against if you remove your users from the admins group. So of course, the first problem is going to be that your users can't install software if it requires admin rights. Now that may or may not be a problem for you. Of course, very large enterprises, they're probably using something like System Center Manager to install software. Other enterprises might need that capability, so it depends what you're doing with your devices. Legacy software sometimes requires administrative rights in order to run. Now there are ways to solve those problems, I'll talk about them in a minute, but it might be an issue. Users will not be able to make any setting changes that require admin privileges. Now, if you're running Windows 10, that probably isn't going to be an issue most of the time for most users, but it could be. Any updates to the software you have installed on the device must be automated, because if those updates require administrative privileges and the user to do something manually, again, they are not going to be able to do that. I want to talk a little bit about user account control and where that fits in with the idea of least privilege security. Now, user account control was introduced in Windows Vista, I think, but let's just talk about Windows 7 because that's what most of us will be using. What is user account control? It's basically a term that encompasses a set of technologies that Microsoft implemented into Windows to make it easier to run as a standard user. So that includes various things. So for instance, file and registry virtualization are in there to basically allow applications that read and write to system protected parts of the file or system registry to do those things without knowing that actually they're no longer an administrator. So there's a virtualization in there to help those legacy applications run. That's one example. There are other things that were done to the operating system, small tweaks, but they're really important things, such as allowing users to change the time zone, which in Windows XP a standard user was not able to do. So if you have a laptop user who goes traveling around the world, that's going to be a big problem for them. Also things like power settings. Some users, they love to play with their power settings for whatever reason. It used to be that unless you had admin access to a device, you were not able to get full control over those settings. Now, user account control is ultimately, at the end of the day, a consumer solution. It's not really intended to be something used in managed environments. In managed environments, Microsoft recommends that you just run with a standard user account, okay, and not a protected administrator account, which is what UAC gives you. Okay. So I discussed some of the issues with managing users, but what about managing software? So if you don't have something like System Center Manager in place, that could be a problem depending on how you distribute software, about whether that's legacy software or not, and is it going to be a problem as a standard user. So of course, in a large-scale environment, I'd recommend something like System Center Configuration Manager, but there are also other options. So you could move legacy applications or whatever applications to Windows Server Terminal Services or to Remote App, which is basically the same thing, or you could move those apps into the cloud. So Microsoft is in the process of retiring Azure Remote App, and that's going to be replaced by Citrix XenApp Essentials. Windows 10 also has built into its application virtualization, where applications are streamed to the machine and run in a virtual container, so they're never actually installed on the device itself. If you're familiar with Office 365 Click to Run, that works on very similar technology to App-V. If you have salespeople who need to run software demos, then Hyper-V might be a solution for them. So you give them a virtual machine and they can install software to their heart's content in that virtualized sandbox, and it doesn't touch their work PC configuration. Now, if you're a more modern organization and you're going forward and starting to use mobile apps and that kind of thing, then the Windows Universal Platform is also an option. So that basically is the apps that you see in the Windows 10 store. And there are lots of advantages to using those apps in terms of security and updating and distribution to users. Lots and lots of advantages. There's also a desktop bridge solution from Microsoft that allows you to port your line of business desktop applications into that Windows Store format. And users don't need administrative rights in order to install applications from the Windows Store. So that's a big advantage to that new technology. If you do have legacy applications that you need to keep running on Windows without using any of the previous solutions that I mentioned, such as Windows Server Remote App or Microsoft App-V, for instance, Microsoft do have a tool to help you out, and it's called the Application Compatibility Toolkit, and it is for basically analyzing the applications that you have on your network and then solving any application issues that might be caused by the standard user accounts on those devices. So for example, some legacy applications, they just will not run without administrative rights. So they actually make a check to see, is that user a member of the local administrative group? And if not, well, we're just not going to run, and that's it, and the application gives you an error message and crashes out. Well, that's no good. What you can do with the Application Compatibility Toolkit is you can use it to deploy what Microsoft calls compatibility shims to your devices, which basically fool the application into thinking, for instance, that the local user is actually a member of the local administrators group. And that's just one example. There are lots of other compatibility shims available as part of that toolkit to solve various different problems, and you can distribute them in your environment using group policy. So what about the actual configuration of the Windows operating system itself? Well, again, these might be solutions that you already have in place. So again, if you need to install software that automatically updates itself, however, maybe it has some built-in auto-update mechanism, you could install it as part of a Windows image. And then you just distribute the image and you don't need to worry about giving users permission to install that software. In terms of OS configuration and the user's own environment, there's of course group policy and group policy preferences, and you can use that to basically configure the OS and the user's own desktop and how that looks. I also wanted to add in here, use a Windows print server, because printers can be a bit of a headache sometimes without administrative privileges if you're not using a Windows print server. So if you have a Windows print server, any printers that a user wants to add from that server will automatically get added and the drivers installed onto their devices without them having to have administrative privileges. The device trusts the Windows print server, it's part of the domain, and those drivers will get installed without any extra privileges required. If you don't use a Windows print server, it might be a slightly different story, depending on the drivers and the printer, of course. Now, what about a user that gets into trouble? Now, this is, we're all used to, most of us used to our users having admin rights, especially notebook users when they're out of the office. It gives us some peace of mind that whatever they need to do, they can do. These two options that I have at the end for Windows configuration, I've mentioned here PowerShell remoting and the VPN or direct access. So those notebook users, make sure that they can get dial-in access to your network. Okay, so they need to be able to connect in so that in the event of a problem, you can connect back to them. Okay. Now, I've mentioned PowerShell remoting here. Once they've got a connection into the network, then you can connect to that machine and you can help them. Now, you don't have to use PowerShell remoting. You can use a GUI tool like computer management, but sometimes they don't always work that well over unreliable internet connections. But PowerShell remoting, if you know how to use it, you can use to manage those machines and even reconfigure them to a certain extent from the command line. So that's always an option if your IT staff have the necessary skills. Okay. Now, this is something new, and I just want to briefly mention it at the end of my part of the presentation. Now, of course, Windows 10 S is really targeted at the moment towards the education sector, but Microsoft's plan is no doubt to expand the audience base for this version of the operating system. So now this operating system, this SDK of Windows 10, let's say, is restricted just to store apps. So you get least privilege security out of the box, okay? There's no admin access to the device. Users cannot install Win32 applications, period. And this has been done, of course, to ensure that the device performs well and stays secure during its entire lifetime, much in the same way as Android and iOS in principle do. There's always the option to upgrade it to Windows 10 Professional if you want, and at the moment I'm just recommending that you should think about this only if you're the kind of business or user that might at the moment use a Chromebook. So if you can live in a browser, then maybe Windows 10 S at the moment is for you. There's also the advantage with Windows 10 S that you can install the full desktop Office applications, and that's something that you can't do with a Chromebook. So it does have that advantage. Okay, so you've probably gathered that there are some disadvantages to least privilege security, but I'd like to think that the advantages considerably outweigh the challenges involved. Now, things like the application compatibility toolkit and solving problems with legacy applications, that can be time consuming. Moving your applications to terminal services can also be time consuming, and we don't all have the resources to do that. And that's where a third-party solution like PowerBroker for Windows comes in. Now, this really gives you the flexibility to say, well, okay, I'm going to take away admin rights from my users, but should they need them for whatever reason, or if an application needs them for whatever reason, I can assign those rights on the fly. So, for instance, Chris will talk a little bit more about this in more detail, but for instance, you've got a notebook user on the road who suddenly needs to install an unsigned printer driver, but they don't have admin rights to do that. Now, with PowerBroker for Windows, you can give them those rights on the fly. They just need to make a quick call to the IT help desk. You can't do that by default in Windows. You don't have all the time involved in testing that you need for using the application compatibility toolkit or moving your line of business applications to terminal services, for instance. So it allows you to also be agile, because if you have new software that you need to install, you also don't have to go through all of that testing, while at the same time you're keeping everything secure with least privilege security. Okay. So now I'm going to hand over to Chris from Beyond Trust, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about those products.
Fantastic. Thank you very much there, Russell. So let me just share out my screen with you, and what we're going to do is give you a little bit of an overview to Beyond Trust and exactly what it is that we're talking about when we talk about the PowerBreak for Windows product, and a little bit around privilege management in general. So as Beyond Trust as an organization, we exist as a software vendor that sits specifically in the cybersecurity space, and we have a suite of products that looks to reduce risk ultimately, whether this be asset-based risk or user-based risk, and ultimately we've created a single platform, as we see here, that unifies the best of breed technologies for addressing both internal versus external risk. So let's take a quick look at some of the pain points that we address here with our solution set. The first is really insider threat, or as it's becoming known now, inside threat. So whenever we hear about stolen credentials, whether it be usernames, passwords, keys, or any issues with administrative rights across workstations, servers, Unix, Linux hosts, and really securing and controlling those privileges, ultimately what we're talking about here is inside threat. And why this is important, we can see a stat here from the Verizon data breach report saying that privileged abuse was behind 81% of insider misuse incidents. So this should really give us an indication that we need to be considering not just our insiders, our internal users and what they do, but also potentially external people, because any external attacker, ultimately their goal is to appear as an inside user. By monitoring and managing inside privilege and ultimately user privilege, you're mitigating a lot of the risk of external people coming in and being able to pose as internal users here. So privileged abuse can really be malicious. If we look at Edward Snowden, who's probably the most high-profile case, it can also be accidental. We do get instances where outside attackers gain privilege through phishing, hacking attacks. Ultimately, the goal is appear as an insider, go undetected. Next up, we look at external hacking. So, ultimately, attackers find their way inside, they do a lot of damage, but the majority of the time what they're actually doing once they're inside, they take advantage of things like system vulnerabilities, so outdated software. The idea being, they'll look for a vulnerability in a solution such as Java or Flash that really gives them the ability to elevate privilege and install malware and any other tools, ultimately enabling lateral movement through an environment and the exfiltration of data. The sad fact is really most exploited vulnerabilities are fairly old school. They've been about generally for over a year and are pretty easy to compromise. There's very common toolkits out there that are easily available, right, from newbies through to very experienced hackers. So what Beyond Trust do as an organization is essentially we have a suite of products that makes it easy to find, fix these problems before attackers are able to take advantage of them. Now, I guess a good question to ask ourselves here is, how long does it really take to figure out if you've been breached? And that brings us to the concept of the hidden threat. And, all too often we hear of breaches. You've got the Sony breach that discovered the breach months after the initial compromise. The attacks generally are pretty targeted at specific kind of organizations and specific sets of data, because ultimately they want to be able to extract something. Whether it's executed by insiders or external people, evidential malicious activity is really hard to pinpoint. Generally, the fact of the matter is you probably have access to so much kind of security information that the evidence of an in-progress attack is often buried in volumes of data. When we think about what our SIEM solutions are consuming, the volume of data, the volume of logs, and are we really doing effective alerting around that data? So privileged access is ultimately the heart of many of today's most high-profile breaches, and if breaches weren't enough, we've got a huge number of compliance regulations that require the management of privileged users. So let's take a look at why this is the case. So first up, we have employees and other insiders that have unnecessary access. We've also got vendors and other insiders given excessive access to systems and data. For the majority of cases, this is, needed to do people's jobs. But without the right discipline and accountability behind things, the excessive rights are just pathways to data. Privilege abuse can be malicious, as we know with Snowden at the NSA, or it can be accidental, such as when outside attackers gain privilege through phishing, hacking, through any other type of attack. Again, what we know here, in 88% of cases, attackers compromise an organization using definable patterns. And what we mean by this is excessive privilege. Ultimately, it's a repeatable thing. So what are some of the problems here? We've got problems with the fact that credentials are shared and unmanaged. So when we think about our environments, when we think about the infrastructure that we've got, every single server that gets built has an administrator account, a root account. It will often be built with a build account that your IT build people are aware of. Sometimes developers are aware of them, and sometimes infrastructure are aware of these. So they get created, they get shared, but they're typically not audited, monitored, or even managed. Generally, these passwords are the same throughout, the server or workstation's lifecycle within an organization. Worse than that, you have many people that leave organizations that take most of these passwords with them. The reason for that is most organizations, are scared to change passwords. They don't know what the impact of changing certain passwords are. So then, once we've got kind of inside an environment, once an attacker, whether they're external, internal, they ultimately then look to cause a lot of damage. So they take advantage of system vulnerabilities, outdated software. So this gives them the ability to elevate privilege, to install malware and other tools for stealing data. And ultimately, the reason for this is because desktops, laptops, servers, and apps communicate and open paths to sensitive data. When you open a particular finance app, behind the scenes it may be connecting to a database. If that application is exploited somehow, then ultimately the data access is given at the back end. And as we spoke about before, most vulnerabilities are pretty old school. They've been out there for a year and they're very easy to compromise. So, what are the tools that Russell was mentioning at the start to do with least privilege, and specifically, in this instance, least privilege for Windows. So we're speaking about a tool called PowerBroker for Windows, and PowerBroker for Windows is there really as a least privilege management tool for the Windows operating system, whether this be a workstation, whether this be a server. So the biggest question, I guess, when you want to start thinking about these types of products is how do you deal with removing user rights without obstructing user productivity or overburdening the help desk? I think the even bigger question to ask around this is really how do you sell this to your user community? There is a big perception when you talk about least privilege with users that you are taking things away from them. But ultimately, least privilege should be a program of enablement. It's about giving users the ability to do certain tasks, about giving them access to the applications they require in order to perform that task, but removing the risk associated with that access. It's not about removing their job or any aspects of their job. So when we look at least privileged tools, there's a few things that, we want a solution to be able to do. The solution must elevate privilege within applications, not to users. If you elevate users, whether it be things like just-in-time privilege or any other type of technology, that user has admin rights for a period of time. By elevating an application, the risk is completely contained to that application. At no point does the user ever receive admin credentials. Really then, once we deal with the elevation, we want to enforce it based on applications' known vulnerabilities. So what do we mean by this? Least privileged access based on known vulnerabilities is a kind of a mechanism for us to restrict access to applications. When you talk about application control, most people think of the concept of whitelisting and blacklisting, and in a rudimentary sense you can think of whitelisting as elevation, but what we generally don't like to do is something called blacklisting. The reason for that is blacklisting is very hard to maintain. You end up with a list of deny objects. You know, it's a bad thing with your enterprise firewalls, it's a bad thing in application control. If you start with the stance of least privilege and then elevate things that users can do, you've got a very good whitelisting policy there that is very familiar from a security concept point of view because you already do this with your firewalls. But we do need to restrict access to apps. And, you know, when we think about internet connected devices, the biggest risk is applications, you know, such as those, you know, Java, Flash, etc. They're some of the most common ones that we see. But you want to restrict access to those applications based on vulnerability data, and that's one of the key capabilities that PowerBroker contains. Restricting access to an app because it's got a vulnerability older than X amount of days or with a certain risk score. What else do we need to do? We need a solution that tracks and controls applications because we need to be aware of what apps are running on our endpoints. We need to be aware of exactly what the users are doing within those apps. And finally, you know, sometimes the ability to capture keystrokes and screens when certain applications are open, so certain critical apps, and you can add lots of wizardry into this, I like to call it, but the ability to, you know, record what a user's doing within a certain application based on the criteria of their connected status. So maybe they've opened a particular sensitive application, but they're connected via a VPN, so they're not on the corporate network. If you record what they're doing when they're in that app, you've then got a complete audit trail of all their activity whilst they're inside it. So PowerBroker for Windows can essentially do, you know, those 6 things plus a lot more. Ultimately, it's there to reduce the risk of privilege misuse on physical and virtual Microsoft Windows servers and desktops. So by this we mean you remove the administrative rights from end users and you enforce least privilege policies, which enables you to then elevate certain applications, tasks or processes from an end user's perspective. And the screenshot that we're looking at here is just a quick view of the management dashboard. So we won't go into this too much, but very simple, very easy to use and very easy to manage. So how do these solutions actually work? What we see here is a very high-level diagram, but we can go into a little bit more detail of this. So the first thing that we need to do as an organization when we think about least privilege is actually define the roles that we're going to have. So who are my users within the organization? What applications should they use? And don't get me wrong, you know, you install these type of technologies, they sit there and they monitor what users are currently open. They'll run in a monitoring mode. So you get to see all the apps that users are opening, what requires elevation and what doesn't. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're using the right applications. Just because it's their current state doesn't mean it's the target state. So we need to think about this roles and what apps should users be running. The next thing we need to do is build the rules and policies. So to do this, we use the PowerBroker dashboard that we've just seen on the previous slide. And building rules is relatively straightforward. There are a number of different ways that you can build a rule. You could do one manually, or we can completely automate that process within our solution. So as soon as we detect that a user has run a particular app and that application requires elevation, within a couple of clicks of a mouse, we can have a rule created so that from that point forward, it then elevates that particular application. Once you have your policies in place, you need to deploy them. And there are, you know, 2 primary mechanisms for deployment of policy. You can leverage your existing group policy management console and deploy via group policy, or if the machines you're deploying aren't necessarily domain joined, then we can also deploy policy via web services. Now, the client sits on the user's workstation and ultimately it pulls down this policy from whether it be group policy or whether it be web services, and it's really there to enforce that policy. even if the machine becomes disconnected from the network or if something changes, the policies still apply because they're cached locally within the registry. The client itself is also protected, so users can't interact with it or try and stop it or anything like that. Ultimately, from that point forward, your rules then apply, and everything that happens on a user's workstation that requires elevation or anything that they do, that's all captured and can be reported on as well. As we mentioned, if you require a new rule at any point, you just simply go back into the dashboard, you see the event that's been previously created, and you click on Create Rule, and it will do the work for you. So what do we see as the key differentiators? So we really see three areas. One is the reducement of risk. And the other two really the ability to achieve compliance and drive better insight into what's going on. So when we talk about risk reduction, ultimately least privilege is a primary risk reduction kind of tool. It's all about removing risk from end users by them having administrative rights. But also we need to look at risk with vulnerable applications. So limiting the ability for applications to execute if they contain vulnerability data is a key thing. When we're looking at compliance, there are so many new kind of compliance standards, and I guess the biggest buzzword at the moment is GDPR, where we all know we're going to have to get better at data management. So tools such as this enable you to gather the data to see what's being done where, and even protect some of that data with our file integrity monitoring and session monitoring there. And then finally, drive better insight to give you that view of what's going on within my environment, who's using what application, should they be using it. Now, ultimately from a product perspective, I mentioned that ultimately we have a suite of tools. So our suite of tools is managed by something called Beyond Insight, and Beyond Insight we see as a central risk management platform, and it's really there to manage the two sides of what Beyond Trust do as an organization. So we have the Power Broker suite of products, which is everything to do with privilege management, whether it be least privilege on the endpoint, least privilege on the server, privilege password management. We then have tools such as our Active Directory Bridge, so that you can integrate your Unix, Linux estate into Active Directory and centrally control and audit everything. But then on the right-hand side, what we've got is the Retina suite, and Retina is our enterprise vulnerability management solution. The good thing that Beyond Insight does is it combines these bits of data. So we're the only PAM vendor that can give you a true view of both asset risk and user risk and combine this information together to give you a single view of risk throughout the enterprise. So why do people look at PowerBreaker for Windows? In reality, we've got very deep capabilities within this area. PowerBreaker for Windows was designed from the ground up to do exactly this thing. It's not a bolt-on for us. It also has some extended capabilities, so the ability to perform things like asset discovery, app control, risk and compliance-based monitoring. We are seen as, I guess, a mature patented leader. So we actually own the patent for application elevation across workstations. Because of our Beyond Insight console, we have centralized reporting, analytics, and management. And essentially what this means is we have a single console to look at all elements of PAM, all elements of risk. So rather than multiple different consoles, multiple reporting platforms, it's a single pane of glass. And ultimately, finally, and probably the most important part, it's part of a broad solution family. Privilege management isn't just about password management. It's not just about endpoint. It really is about three key things: enterprise password security, endpoint least privilege management, whether that be Windows or Mac, and then server least privilege. And by server, it's every flavor of Unix, Linux, all your Windows estate. And it's really those three pillars of PAM, we like to call them, that are the broader family, and that's really what most organizations need to be thinking about when they want to reduce risk to do with privilege throughout the estate. So we're going to head into a Q&A session now, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand over to you, Sarah.
Chris. Thank you so much. Okay, guys, let's jump into some Q&A. But if you could, right before we jump into the last little bit of this presentation and the questions, here at Beyond Trust, we'd love to help you with your privileged access and even your vulnerability management needs. Would you be interested in engaging with one of our security experts further? We'd love to chat or take you through a more thorough one-on-one demo of PowerBroker. Let us know. Select yes. I'm going to leave this up. Let's dive into some questions. Russell, these came in while you were speaking. Let me know if you need some clarification. We can always ask the people who sent these questions in. Russell, how do you generate a report to show who has local admin access?
Well, there's probably numerous ways you could do that. But you could probably use PowerShell to do that. I have a feeling that there's something within the application compatibility toolkit that might also do that. But it's definitely doable. But it would depend on exactly what your scripting skills are and what tools you have access to. So it's not a very clear answer, but it's very doable.
Russell, what about font installation? Those require admin rights.
So what kind of installation?
Font.
Font installation. Font installation. That is a very good question. I think that probably font installation, you would either have to package them into your existing Windows image, or you would have to build a separate installer to do that through something like System Center Configuration Manager, which will basically run the installer with elevated privileges on behalf of the user that's logged onto the device.
And Chris, feel free to jump in if you have any solutions too. Russell, where can I download the application compatibility toolkit?
It is part of the Windows Assessment and Deployment toolkit. So you can't download it as a separate entity. You have to download that entire thing, and it's part of that. But if you just Google that, Windows Assessment and Deployment Toolkit, you will find that there on Microsoft's website.
Okay, I'm going to close this poll down real quick, and let's jump into a couple more questions. Russell, what's the best way to remove admin rights from users?
The best way to do it, I would say, probably the best way to do it is to either use group policy restricted groups or to use group policy preferences. And basically with those tools you can define who is a member of the local administrators group. Of course, what you've got to be careful of when you implement that kind of configuration is not to remove accounts from the local administrators group that really do need to be there. So you need to audit your machines and make sure that you know exactly what's going on with that configuration. But group policy and group policy preferences, there are two different ways to do it. Group policy preference is usually the preferred method to define who is a member of that group.
Chris, this came in for you. Can PowerBroker work in a work group environment?
It can, absolutely, yes. So you can deploy the policies via web services. The client can get pushed out via any means of technology, or it can be a manual install, and the policies will apply regardless of the connected status of that machine.
Another question for you, is the central database stored locally or in the cloud?
It can actually be either. So you can have an on-prem deployment of the central database and the policy side of things, or you could deploy it in somewhere like Azure or AWS.
Is this in essence a quote-unquote run as replacement that leverages an admin account automatically based on policy?
So you could in fact use it that way, but most of the time, for most applications that are launched, the way in which it actually works is it adds a security token into the application that's being launched itself. So if you run an app on your desktop the application still runs under the context of the user. So nothing changes in the user experience, the user behavior, or the permissioning of the application that's being launched itself. But what happens is this security token, by default it's usually the administrator's group security token, or SID, gets added to the application, which ultimately elevates it. You could also right-click on an app and run elevated, and we do also have a secure run as capability as well.
Chris, how well does PowerBroker work across geo distributed environments where connectivity is poor or just via the internet?
Of course, yeah. So really the connectivity required is for pulling down of policy. So once a machine has its policy, if there's very few or infrequent updates, it really doesn't matter on the connected status of the machines. They can be completely offline at all times and the policy will still apply. It's only really if you are updating policy that a machine will need to call into a network to retrieve its updates.
Chris, Erwin is asking, could you share some more technical background on how elevation is achieved?
Yeah, sure. So possibly just kind of mention that with the security token being added to the application. But ultimately we have kernel level integration into the Microsoft operating system. One of the technologies that Russell was talking about, their group policy preferences, it's actually, well, it was a Beyond Trust product. So we actually made that and Microsoft brought it off us back in 2008. But we have the same kind of technology built into PowerBroker for Windows and the same capabilities as that. So we have very tight and very integrated kind of capabilities from a software point of view with the Windows operating system. And as I mentioned, whenever a user clicks on an app, it's a security token that's being added to the application at runtime. So users don't receive writes, nothing changes for the application apart from the fact it's now running with an additional layer of security.
Okay, that is the end of questions. Thanks everybody for being super engaged and asking questions and you know, making Chris talk and work for his water this morning. So appreciate that. A kind reminder that you will receive an email with a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 2 business days from now, and it will come from communications@beyondtrust.com. So make sure that that email is whitelisted so you receive the follow-up email without any interruption, and then you can forward it on to your colleagues or rewatch to your heart's desire. A huge thanks again to our speakers, Russell and Chris. You guys are awesome. Thanks for cramming in a lot of information in an hour. We really appreciate it. And to everybody who attended live, thank you for being here today. Have a wonderful rest of your day and your week, and we will see you guys at our next webinar. Take care, everybody, and goodbye.